Archaeopteryx is arguably the most important fossil species of all time. It's the fossil that proved Darwin right about natural selection as one of the major mechanisms of evolution. It's also the fossil that is the one fossil that taught us that birds are living dinosaurs. I have to be me, and that's something I learned from my mother. My mother was always just true to herself. And so it's not like I sought out to look different from other paleontologists. It's just who I am.
Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
I am so excited today to have Jingmai O'Connor with us today, paleontologist. We're going to have a great time and just dive into a little bit about her and her journey. I think this is super cool. It's an area that I'm definitely interested in, but I never really had exposure or experience to actually what a paleontologist really was. So happy to have you with me here today, Jingmai.
Thank you so much for having me, Aisha. I'm really excited to chat with you today.
Yes, so I was looking into your background a little bit, and I must say the first thing I really noticed was that, although you are a paleontologist, you kind of have gotten the AKA punk rock paleontologist. And I love that. And I saw so many pictures of you. Love your tattoos, I have to say. And I think I just wanted to kind of start my first question with how does it feel to be in a space where, you kind of look very unconventional to what the typical paleontologist looks like?
Yeah, I have to be me, and that's something I learned from my mother. My mother was always just true to herself. And so it's not like I sought out to look different from other paleontologists. It's just who I am. It is sometimes rather difficult, because I can tell when, especially now that I'm at the Field Museum, which is like an important job, and I get introduced to people, this is our dinosaur curator, and I can see the look in people's eyes where they don't expect me. Or, for example, I'm taking some, young adults to the field with me, and their parents are dropping them off to go on this 2-week expedition. And they look at me and they're like, "This girl's in charge. This girl's gonna keep my kids alive," or like, and rural Montana, and yeah. I mean, what do I do with that? Like, I have to just keep being true to myself and just hope that the work speaks for itself. But I also want to say that I think it's changing. Maybe I'm the most well-known tattooed punk rock paleontologist, but there actually are quite a few. There are some who are more punk rock than me and don't like that I am the punk rock paleontologist. And I'm like, there can be more than one, guys. Like, but yeah, people like to remind me at the Field Museum that I'm not the first tattooed curator they've had. They had another curator who was a
Mm.
curator of insects who, yeah, was also covered in tattoos. So I think, for all people who feel like maybe they don't fit in for what the stereotypical scientist is supposed to look like, they can be, rest assured knowing that we are moving into a much more colorful, more diverse future cohort of scientists.
That's really good to hear, because I know, coming from a STEM and STEAM space, even myself, as an engineer, not seeing that representation, it's good to know and hear that, these things are changing. I'm sure that we still have a long way to go, but it's just nice to know that we have come so far, in what, a paleontologist looks like. So, can you just talk to me a little bit about like your background, how you got into being a paleontologist? I mean, that's such like even a big word like for a kid. So, is this something that as a kid you're like, I want to be a paleontologist? So, how did your journey really start in this field?
Yeah, my origin story, I guess is the way to phrase it, is very different than every other paleontologist I've ever met. Like every single paleontologist I've met will tell me, I was 3 years old and I knew this is what I wanted to do. Or the other option is I saw Jurassic Park and I knew this is what I wanted to do. And I'm like, oh, Jurassic Park. I mean, they're not really doing paleontology in that movie, but anyways, like I get it. Yeah, studying extinct animals. Yeah, so all these other people have had this focus for their entire lives, which is something that's really impressive. I also personally think it's a little weird, you know? But anyways, but I discovered paleontology in college. So my mother is a geologist, and I'll tell you that story in a second. But basically, because of her geology background, I entered college like the only declared freshman geology major. And but within the field of geology, I didn't really know. I hadn't discovered a passion yet. And so the first year, I take a class called Historical Geology, which takes you from the Big Bang all the way to modern day Earth. And in this class, I just fall in love with the concept, with with the process of evolution. And if you are already a geologist, then the way you study evolution is through the lens of paleontology, which is by studying the, now petrified remains of once living organisms that we find in the geological record. Because I was a little bit late coming to the game of paleontology, I didn't have a specific interest, like a specific group of animals I really wanted to work on. I loved it all, right? So when I applied to go to grad school, I applied to work on echinoderms, invertebrate fossils. I applied to work on trace fossils like coprolites, which are fossil poop. I applied to work on fossil mammals like marine reptiles, everything. And in the end, I ended up working on birds, but that was my a choice that I made. That was my practical choice. So I feel like I made the impractical, passionate choice to be a paleontologist. And then when going pursuing grad school, I decided to study fossil birds because it was an area of paleontology that was drastically growing at the time. So I thought this is an area where there's lots of new fossils, lots of new research to do, an area where I can make an impact in the field versus I'm not saying people who work on T-Rex are not making an impact in the field, but it's like there's not a lot of fossils, there's not a lot of new fossils, so it's kind of like going over the same questions again, like just exactly how strong could it bite, that kind of thing. And whereas bird fossils are super rare, and we have just very very few fossils throughout the year, throughout since Archaeopteryx was found in 1861. There's been Archaeopteryx and a couple late Cretaceous fossils from America, from North America, and then just one or two fossils here from Argentina, one or two fossils here from Brazil, from Mongolia. But then in the 90s, all these fossil birds started pouring out of China, and I'm half Chinese, and I've been always really fascinated by my Chinese culture, so I felt like studying these fossils was kind of a way to combine these two interests, and yeah, here I am.
That is really cool. So I know that, currently you're the associate curator of fossil reptiles at the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago. You touched a little bit on kind of some of your interests in your work. Can you really talk about like what your role entails there?
Yeah. So being a curator involves lots of different roles, right? You have your role as a research scientist, which is technically our primary role and my favorite role. I'm obsessed with research. But we also have to do service for the museum, which is probably like my least favorite part, just being on committees and things like that, like the bureaucracy side of science, which, exists everywhere. But we also have to do outreach, we do science communication, and we also work with exhibits. And so those things are also really fun, right? Like, for example, I mentioned that the Field Museum recently acquired the 13th skeletal Archaeopteryx, and it's a beautiful specimen. So the first exhibit that I ever curated was, the permanent exhibit that we put together for this fossil. And just seeing the exhibit for the first time just it's such a joyous feeling, like, such an amazing feeling. I don't even know how to describe it. I guess it's probably like when you, like, give birth to a baby and you, like, see your baby for the first time. I mean, like, sorta like that, like, as a childless dog mother, like, that's how I imagine it must be. But yeah, so it's just really cool to design an exhibit in order to figure out the best way to share information with the public, the best way to get people excited about what you're excited about, right? Like, 'cause I'm very excited about this Archaeopteryx. I also, have students and postdocs that I train, like training the next generation of scientists. That's also something that's I think is really important. It's also a lot of fun. There's like every day at the Field Museum, you're doing something different. And that's one reason why I really just enjoy being a scientist in general. One reason I'll tell people to be a scientist is that, every day is different. You're learning something new, other people are learning new things, you're reading their papers, new techniques are coming out, new fossils are coming out. It's just like always, always different, always changing, always keeping you on your toes, always exciting.
That sounds really cool. And I know that, the museum, has that fossil reptile collection. Can you talk a little bit about like maybe what makes it unique, where you are?
Yeah, every museum that has a collection has a unique collection, right? Like there's, that reflects the scientists that have worked at that museum since it opened, right? Which is kind of cool to think about. Like, for example, one of our recently retired curators studied marine reptiles. So he's out there collecting marine reptiles. So we have a lot of those. For example, we have like the first giant ichthyosaur that was ever found. So it's just kind of interesting to think about how the collection reflects the people who built it, right? The history that's there. But what really makes our collection special, I guess the stars of our collection would be Sue the T Rex, which was until fairly recently the largest known adult T Rex ever found and the most complete adult T Rex. Now, just, to be completely fair and honest, it doesn't really hold either of those titles anymore. There is now a T Rex called Scotty that is slightly bigger.
Scotty.
It's not as nice as ours, it's not as complete, but it is slightly bigger. And there's also another T Rex that's found that's a juvenile. So it's immature, it's small-ish. I've never seen it actually, but it's 100% complete. And it's preserved battling a triceratops. Like, how cool is that? So, okay,
Wow,
that's not
that
at our
is really
museum, not to confuse
cool.
people. That's at, yeah, the North Carolina Museum, being studied by another amazing female paleontologist named Lindsay Zano. But we have Stu, which is the most famous T Rex because this other one is recent and people don't know about it yet. But let's enjoy the fame while we can. So yeah, people come to the Field Museum to see Stu the T Rex. It's our big star. But more recently, we acquired this Archaeopteryx. And even though most people don't know what Archaeopteryx is, I'm like, that brand Arcteryx? You know that little thing? That's an Archaeopteryx. That's like how I have to describe it to people. But Archaeopteryx is arguably the most important fossil species of all time. And it's for several reasons. One, it's because it's the fossil that proved Darwin right about natural selection as one of the major mechanisms of evolution. It's also the fossil that is the one fossil that taught us that birds are living dinosaurs. Like every time a scientist was like, I think birds are dinosaurs, they did so by looking at Archaeopteryx. And Archaeopteryx is also the only like Jurassic bird, the oldest fossil bird that's ever been found. So, birds as the most diverse group of land vertebrates on our planet are one of evolution's great success stories. So the earliest piece of evidence we have for understanding why birds are the only group of dinosaurs to survive the end Cretaceous mass extinction and why they're so successful today, like that first piece of evidence is Archaeopteryx. So that's really like, this has been like my entire 2024 has been like selling people Archaeopteryx, in case you can't tell from how quickly it's rolling off my tongue. But really, it is the most important specimen we have in the entire museum. I'm not just talking the fossil reptile collection. I'm talking all collections. It's the most valuable thing we have. And yeah, and it's really, really exciting. And I really want to encourage people to come see it and the beautiful exhibit I put together. It's just been really fun journey working on this thing.
That is so cool, and what is coming off is your passion. I love how passionate you are. You mentioned Jurassic Park, like the movies we all know. How much of that is like some of it is like really real and really like sensationalized? Because I think that, even in technology, I know a lot of times, so like my husband is a computer engineer. When we're watching like, futuristic and technology movies, he's like, that is really not possible. Like, I mean, and I know, like, for the movies, they have to sensationalize it. But are there any aspects of the movie, like, that you're watching, you're like, yeah, that's really like spot on, like right there. I'm just super curious about that.
Well, like in Jurassic Park, it's mostly about, it's actually mostly about like DNA, right? And it's actually about
Mm.
about cloning organisms, which is a whole different area of research than paleontology, because there absolutely are people trying to de-extinct extinct animals by through cloning and, using DNA of extinct animals. The actual paleontology part of Jurassic Park, I think, is very brief, right? So, like, I'm just gonna
Mm.
be like, complete disclosure. Yes, I've seen the movie, but like once or twice a long time ago. I don't like. I think they're like using lidar to find fossils underneath the ground that they can't see. Like, I recall maybe that's a thing. No, paleontologists don't do that. I remember like there's like some, yeah, like the digging part is real. Yes, to get the fossils out of the ground,
Mhm.
we have to get down and dig them out. I think that's the only thing that's accurate in that entire movie. But at the same time, people are always asking me, like, will Jurassic Park be real? Can we bring these dinosaurs back? And I always kind of, first of all, I respond with two things. One, I feel like trying to bring dinosaurs back is like the 21st century version of Whitey's on the moon. I'm like, there's all these problems on our planet. Like, why would we
Right.
be trying to
Why
bring
would
back
what
dinosaurs, right? Like, yeah. Number two, it's like, did you see the movie? It did not end well. Like, bringing dinosaurs back is not a good idea, at least according to the movie, right? But actually, now we are able to find traces of DNA in dinosaurs. I know like some that are, I think the oldest one is like 120 million years ago, but it's not actual sequences of DNA that you could use to clone them. It's just we use histochemical stains that bind with DNA molecules, and you use them with living tissues, and it will bind only with like the nucleus, right, where the DNA is.
Mhm.
And if we take a fossil cell that's 120 million years old and we dissolve away the rock and we put the stain on it, the stain will also bind only with the nucleus that we can see, the fossilized nucleus within the cell.
Mm.
So they're telling us that there are traces of DNA in very old fossils, but and maybe in 100 years, it'll get to the point where we are able to do something with that. But the studies of dinosaur DNA are in their infancy right now. And actually, it's very cool stuff that's being done by one of my former postdocs, another female scientist named Alida
Nice.
Bayol, who's, still working at the Institute of Vertebrate Paleontology and Paleoanthropology in Beijing, where I worked for 10 years. So and like I just love that just by coincidence, the two scientists that I've happened to like mention just because it's come up are both female scientists.
Yeah, absolutely love that. That is so cool. And I know that, you talked a few minutes ago just about like that dinosaur bird connection. And, just looking at like the evolution of birds from like a theropod dinosaurs, it is really one of the like most fascinating transitions in evolution, in terms of that evolutionary history. Can you first define like what a theropod dinosaur is?
Theropod dinosaurs are your bipedal, mostly carnivorous dinosaurs like T Rex, like Velociraptor, and also include birds. Like birds are living theropod dinosaurs. And the way we figured this out actually goes back to, the earliest ideas of evolution by means of natural selection. So Darwin publishes his book in 1859, right? And, at this point, he's already like on the older side. So he's not out there debating in favor of his theory. Like he left this to younger scientists. And one of the people who was really like leading the charge on these debates was a man named Thomas Huxley, who's often referred to as Darwin's bulldog. Thomas Huxley studies Archaeopteryx and he studies another theropod dinosaur from the same deposits called Compsognathus. So to go back to our like Jurassic Park, like, remember when a bunch of tiny little theropod dinosaurs mob that hunter and kill him? Those are those are Compsognathus, sometimes referred to as compies. Yeah, so Compsognathus is a theropod dinosaur. It's not that closely related to birds, like in the relative scheme of theropod dinosaurs, but there's still enough similarities that he's looking at Archaeopteryx and he's looking at Compsognathus. And Huxley is essentially the first person to suggest that birds are living dinosaurs. Now, he did not say this directly. He wasn't like birds are dinosaurs. But what he said in modern phylogenetic thinking would be interpreted as birds are dinosaurs. Basically, he was like, you take a reptile, you take Compsognathus, and you take birds, and he was like, that would be like an evolutionary like chain, right? But that means that if you evolve from something, you still belong to that group. Like technically, humans are fish, right? We're Sarcopterygian fish. So technically, by saying that, noticing this relationship, he was saying that birds are theropod dinosaurs. Now, this idea was rejected for about 100 years. And the main reason it was rejected was because an artist, so one thing that's cool about paleontology is paleontology and art are intimately related, I think more so than other scientists. But an artist wrote a book about the origin of birds. And in it, he was like, no dinosaur we've ever found preserves a wishbone, right? Which is your clavicles, your collarbones fused together into a single bone that we play with on Thanksgiving. That's the wishbone, called a furcula. Yeah. So he noticed like no dinosaur preserves a furcula or a wishbone, so birds can't be dinosaurs. That was his, argument, and everyone bought it. And then fast forward almost exactly 100 years later. So it was like early 1870s that Huxley first proposed this. Now, fast forward to like 1971, an American paleontologist named John Ostrom had recently described Deinonychus. He described it in 1969. Deinonychus is the dinosaur in Jurassic Park that they call Velociraptor, but Velociraptor was a very small theropod dinosaur. This much larger animal is actually Deinonychus. And so Deinonychus, like the first fossil he had was a really nice fossil, so he can really understand the anatomy of this animal. And then at this point, also 100 years later, many more specimens of Archaeopteryx
Yeah,
have
I
been
was
found.
gonna
Okay,
say
yeah,
a lot has changed in that time
yeah,
period.
yeah. So I think at that point, there were maybe like 8 specimens that had been found. So he's able to study these specimens and he starts noticing these similarities between Archaeopteryx and Deinonychus. And Deinonychus, as a dromaeosaurid dinosaur, is actually very closely related to birds. So there's even more anatomical, like skeletal similarities between Deinonychus and Archaeopteryx than there were between Compsognathus and Archaeopteryx. So based on these observed similarities, which I'm not really going to bore you guys with because it's just like really anatomical details, but like things like the shape of the wrist and the way the foot is constructed, like we're very similar. So he's like, I think Huxley's right. I think birds are dinosaurs. But, again, the scientific community doesn't really embrace this idea despite the ample evidence that Ostrom had put forth. And it wasn't until 25 years later that the first feathered dinosaurs were found in China that then people, really had to fully accept this, accept the fact that birds are dinosaurs. And it's interesting because feathers are one of the unique features of birds. Among living animals today, only birds have feathers. Now we now know that birds inherited feathers from dinosaurs that are closely related to them, but we didn't know that at the time. So, but if you see a dinosaur that looks like something like Deinonychus. And you see not only it's preserving feathers, but the feathers are arranged on the arm, forming a structure that looks like a wing. It's like smaller than a bird's wing, so it can't be used for flight, but it's clearly a wing, right? So this is evidence that anyone can see and understand, right? And see the connection between birds and dinosaurs. You don't have to be a paleontologist to like look at the minutia of the way the wrist is constructed. You can just see these feathers and be like, oh, like you can see the connection between birds and dinosaurs. And since then, we've found tons of new evidence that further supports this dinosaur bird connection. So, for example, you know how birds will sleep with their like head tucked under their wing? We actually have a
Yes.
little, yeah, right? It's so cute. We have a little dinosaur called Meilong. It means sleeping dragon, and that's exactly how it's
How
fossilized.
it's
It's
sweet.
fossilized with its head tucked back underneath the wing. Very cute. We now have evidence of that birds inherited colored eggs from non-avian dinosaurs. Possibly contact incubation of eggs is something also that appeared in dinosaurs very closely related to birds. So we have more than just skeletal evidence. We have behavioral evidence, we have chemical evidence, we even have molecular evidence that very strongly shows that birds are living dinosaurs.
Yeah, I mean, this is so fascinating. And this is why, like research is so important. And I think to, have people understand not only, just actually people who practice, but the research for us to understand why things exist, why things are happening now is just as important as, making the discoveries. Is like you have to have the research. And if you don't know the history, then, it's hard to go forward to be able to understand what could possibly happen in the future. So such
Absolutely.
fascinating stuff.
Yeah, and that's actually why paleontology is so relevant right now because,
Mhm.
before, like for NSF grants, for anyone who's a nerd out there, you have to apply for scientific funding to do your research because
Yes.
every job is like you must run an externally funded research
Mhm.
program. Like they're not going to give you the money to do it. You got to get that money. You got to earn it.
That's right.
And it's very difficult. So the main, funding source is is NSF, the National Science
Mhm.
Foundation. And every grant has to have a broader impact section. Like, how is
Yes.
this research going to improve the world, right? And so that's, much easier for engineers or for medical doctors. But for paleontologists, like, how is my research going to make the world a better place? It used to be a very difficult thing to kind of sell. But actually, now we are in the 6th mass extinction of our planet. And it is a human caused mass extinction. And I personally believe that this should be the biggest concern of everyone on our planet, right? Like we all have to work together to shift, to try to mitigate this crisis, right? So the only way for us to understand how organisms react to such climate change as we are causing is by looking at the fossil record. So suddenly paleontology is extremely relevant. Though we can look at the 5 past mass extinctions in Earth history and see how different groups of organisms have reacted differently to different types of environmental crises, and we can then predict how animals are going to go extinct in the very near future. And so, yeah, paleontology has suddenly become relevant in a
Like,
kind of
so
for a
cool.
depressing reason. But
I think that is, like, so interesting. You talked a little about modern discoveries and, other areas, but I know there are a lot of modern discoveries in avian paleontology. So, if you could talk a little bit about avian paleontology and what you think is, like, the most exciting kinda discovery, or area of research, within avian paleontology.
yeah, okay. So, like that's my area of research. I study Mesozoic birds specifically. So avian paleontology goes into the Cenozoic, but like, yeah, not to be rude, I kind of lose interest at that point. Uh, yeah, like so I really care about, from the first bird, Archaeopteryx, 150 million years old, right up until the end Cretaceous mass extinction. So the two questions that I really seek to understand with my research are which group of dinosaurs is most closely related to birds, to basically understand how birds evolve from feathered theropod dinosaurs, which we call peniraptorans. Like how did flight evolve? How did they go from I mentioned they all have these little feathered wings, but how did one group of them evolve those wings to be used for powered flight? And did this happen only once? Because actually, it seems like perhaps some form of flight may have evolved in dinosaurs multiple times. So that's one of the big questions. Did flight evolve once in dinosaurs, or did it evolve 4 or 5 times? So that's one area of research. The other area of research is to understand why birds are the only group of dinosaurs to survive the end Cretaceous mass extinction. And that's the area of research that's really relevant to the current environmental crisis. And like I said, I love paleontology. I'm passionate about paleontology, but my priority is sustainability. So anytime I'm
Mm,
given a soapbox like ignition sequence, sorry, I just think it's really important to kind of push this subject on people because I think there's a
yeah.
lot of people want to ignore it because the crisis is so enormous. And I think
Mhm.
people are afraid to face this crisis and afraid to see how bad it is. And I
Yeah.
understand that absolutely. But if we continue to keep our heads in the sand, it's only going to get worse. And so, I really try to live my life as sustainably as possible. No single use plastics. I ride my bicycle. I mean, don't get me wrong. I still love flying around on airplanes. So like I'm a hypocrite, but I think it's important to do what we can. And, yeah. So, by understanding why large dinosaurs, why also some birds went extinct in this, at this event will help us to understand, how we can preserve certain groups of species in our current environmental crisis. But it's also just a really interesting question. Why did only one group of dinosaurs survive? Why did birds survive? And it's not just to say that birds survive, because there were all these groups of birds alive in the end Cretaceous, and only one group survives. All the other ones go extinct. So yeah, it's what I love about research is the mystery, is trying to solve these questions and trying to figure, these puzzles. And so that is something that is very puzzling. We don't have the answer to it. We are still, kind of pushing forward, trying to find more and more information, but we need the fossils in order to do that. And fossils from the late Cretaceous are very rare. So we're working with very, very limited to material to try to answer this very important question. I think the question about which group of dinosaurs is most closely related to birds is one where we have a ton of data, actually. Most of these fossils coming out of China, thousands of fossils that are mostly complete, which is very rare. Usually, when you have a fossil, you just have a few of the bones.
Right.
The bones are articulated, which means like hip bones connected to the leg bone, which is also important because then you know how the bones fit together. Whereas if they're scattered, you kind of have to figure that out, and
You
maybe
have
you're
to
going to
put
get
them
it
back
wrong.
together. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Like, what angle the femur would fit into the, hip socket. Like, these are all questions that are answered for us by having these articulated fossils. But these fossils are so spectacular that they even preserve more than just the skeleton. So in many cases we have feathers. That's the most commonly preserved soft tissue, but we also sometimes have traces of skin, traces of muscles, traces of internal organs. We also have indicators like stomach contents that also tell us important aspects of the animal's biology that we just, gives us the answer so we don't have to try to figure it out by looking at like the shape of the teeth or the shape of the, you know, different bones in the skull. They can tell us about bite force and things like that. So, but even with all this information, it just seems that the more information we get, the more confusing it is. So, for example, I used to really be on the train, the multiple origins of dinosaur flight train, if you if you will. So, because some people think like the common ancestor of all flying dinosaurs was a flying animal, and then technically things like Velociraptor and Deinonychus are secondarily flightless, like an ostrich, right? Lost the ability to fly. So that's one group of researchers. That's what they believe. And I was in the other group of researchers thinking that flight had actually evolved in dinosaurs multiple times. But then, but then I started working with a postdoc who studies who's actually an ornithologist. They study living birds and they study feathers, right? So we started looking at the feathers, patterns of feathers, both in living birds and in these dinosaurs. And all the evidence that we collected there actually suggested that the common ancestor of all dinosaurs was the common ancestor of flying dinosaurs was a flying animal. And so, and as much as like I can't deny that data, I don't I don't think that one additional piece of data necessarily gives us the answer, but I was definitely like, "Oh man, like really?" And basically what it was is like we went and actually looked at how the wing of modern birds is constructed, which surprisingly no one has ever done. No one's ever done that, which was crazy. So we were able to show that all birds that fly have between 9 and 11 primary feathers. And so primary feathers are the feathers that primarily make up the wing surface, right? That are primarily responsible for generating the lift that birds use to fly. And so, yeah, if you fly, you have a very narrow range of primaries. It's very strange, right? There must be some biomechanical constraint there. And birds that don't like have lost the ability to fly a long time ago will then evolve different functions of the wing and they'll evolve different numbers of primaries, right? Sometimes they even lose primaries altogether. But then we looked at the earliest dinosaurs that had these little wing structures, but they're not flying, right? And and we saw that they have the same number of primary feathers as flying dinosaurs. So, yeah, that kind of suggests that that's the ancestral condition and that the ancestral condition was an animal that was using these little wings to fly. I think what it really just tells us is that we need fossils that are even older. We have to go further back. We're actually
Are there
not capturing the earliest evolutionary stages of the wing. Anyways, this is probably pretty too nerdy and boring, but to me it's like
No,
really
no,
exciting.
but I think that
Uh,
is really important because I think one of the things you mentioned about, like people just want to ignore it and bury their, heads in the sand. It's like you still have to make some connections to even understand like why sustainability is related to your particular area of research, right? And for many people who don't understand, have no awareness, it's harder to say, "Okay, I'm gonna commit to, living a sustainable life as much as possible," right? There are some things, like you said, flying, like getting from one place to another that we may not be able to help, but just even understanding how these areas are connected, I think it's really important for, just the public to just even have even a general awareness, even if they don't have the granular version, that high level 50, thousand view is still really important. So I mean, you talked about like, the current kind of mass extinction. Can you just talk about, how paleontology is contributing to understanding the current mass extinction? Because I think that that's also, another area of just even helping the public have more awareness as to what this is about.
Yeah. So, our current mass extinction is there's several factors that are contributing to it, but of course, one of the ones that we're all very aware of is the fact that we are emitting all these greenhouse gases into our atmosphere that's warming our planet, right? This is something, we're all very, very much aware of, even if we're not doing anything to stop it. But anyway, sorry, I'm such a dummy. Um, but okay, but for example, if we look at the past five mass extinctions in Earth's history, there is one called the Permo-Triassic extinction that stands out above all other mass extinctions as the worst in Earth's history. It's sometimes referred to as the Great Dying. And if we look at what caused that mass extinction, it was a similar cause as to what we're seeing now. It was basically the emission of enormous amounts of CO2 into the atmosphere, not because of cows, cars, and industry. It was because of giant yeah, huge amounts of volcanism that were going on at that time, just pumping out all this CO2. And if we look at how much CO2 we are emitting compared to how much we estimate that those volcanoes were spitting out, it's like 80 times more that we are emitting. And we're emitting it over a very, very short period of time, like very, very quickly, right? And the thing is, what causes animals to go extinct? It's when the environment changes so fast that you cannot evolve to keep up with it. And that's like, so what we're doing is we're doing worse than what caused the greatest extinction of all time, and we're doing it faster, which means animals are less likely to be able to adapt and survive through this crisis. And, we are like, our planet is a very, very complex web of organisms that we rely on each other. I mean, even the oxygen that we breathe is produced by, trees as well as sea organisms. And without these other organisms, we will go extinct. And I think as a paleontologist, like study extinction. So it's something that I am very familiar with. I think the average person isn't really intimately, doesn't really like they aware of extinction, but they don't really like think about it, or it's not, they don't really feel it in their heart. Okay, like erase that. I don't,
Yeah, I
hold
think
on.
that,
Let me,
like, they
like,
really may not feel like it's, like, current present day.
yeah, I mean, it's like we all know, like, the dodo and passenger pigeons and all these things that have gone extinct. But I think it's one, I think it actually is a problem with just the human brain, right? Like, we all know we're going to die, right? That is the one thing that, like, this is the universal, like, equalizer, right? Every human, doesn't matter how rich or poor, whatever, we're all going to die. But we all kind of deny that to ourselves. It's like everybody can't really wrap their, minds around the fact that they will die. And I think it's the same thing with extinction, right? Extinction is death. And I think it's just something that our brains just inherently kind of find it very difficult to deal with, or to, to really come to terms with. But yeah, so anyways, so for example, that's one case study where we can look at the Permo-Triassic extinction. We can see exactly what caused it and which groups of organisms went extinct. We can see how it affected the oceans, how it is, acidified the oceans and caused enormous anoxia in the ocean. So there's no oxygen in the water. So then all the organisms die. So we can see what will happen as a result of all this CO2 emissions, right? So we know what's going to happen if we don't stop, that we are going to acidify the oceans and everything's going to die. And like you have to think about like societies that depend on food from the ocean. What's going to happen to them? Like what's going to happen? We know that the ice caps are going to melt and that sea level is going to rise. And we have seen, because during the Mesozoic, that was a period, it was a greenhouse world. It was much warmer. There were no polar ice caps. So sea levels were much higher. So we know what land will be lost. Like, so it's not just about what other organisms are going to go extinct. It's like, how are we as a people going to be affected? There's lots of popular movies like 2 days after the day before tomorrow. What is the name of that movie? Okay.
I know what
What's it
you're
called?
talking
The day
about.
after tomorrow,
The
something
day
like,
after tomorrow.
there's like, I was
Mhm.
just thinking of the South Park sketch where it's like 2 days before the day after tomorrow. And they're like, oh no, that's today. And they all start panicking. Anyways, like, and they're all like, we didn't listen. And I think about that all the time because I'm like, that's us. Like, we didn't listen.
That is
And
us. We have all this information, all these resources, and that is very, like, a human just characteristic, like, "Oh, I'll think about it tomorrow," or, it's like, you got to think about it today, like, now.
Yeah, yeah, and, like, so I have to keep, like, my own opinions about, like, the future of humanity to myself because I'm the curator at a museum where I have to, interact with children and be like, "There is hope," and, like, whether or not I truly believe that, like, I mean, I just think it's important regardless of whether there's hope or not, that when I die, I'm gonna say that I wasn't part of the problem. At least I did what I could, And at least then I can like
Right.
go to my own grave, like knowing that like, yeah, at least I wasn't part of the problem. And I think that if everybody at least shifts and tries to do the best they can, that actually we would make a huge difference. And so, yeah, but it's like I also get it that if you're, speaking about this environmental crisis to children, it's a balance between like presenting the facts, but also presenting not in such a way that they feel hopeless. And it's
Yeah.
really tragic what we've done to our planet. It's such a beautiful planet that has given us so much. And yeah, so sorry to go
Yeah.
on
I
such a
mean,
dark turn. Like, let's just
oh,
cut all that out.
no, 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 no. So, like, I mean, speaking of like what we've like done to our planet and things, we have to, just recognize like technology's impact, in paleontology, and so technology like 3D scanning and AI is really, I would think, transforming like how you all like study fossils. How would you say these like innovations have maybe shaped the future of paleontology? And, what excites you most about this technology making an impact in paleontology?
Yeah, so I mean, first of all, for AI, like I'm sorry to keep on my like Debbie Downer train, but like, AI we know uses an enormous amount of energy. So AI is very environmentally unfriendly. So unless you had a really good reason to use it, I wouldn't use it. And I do know that like also, so I do know some paleontologists are using it, but in order for it to be really helpful, you have to basically have huge sample sizes that the AI is helping you to like sort through, right? So if you study fossil pollen, for example, AI is great. If you study fossil birds and there aren't that many specimens, then it's not so useful. But things like CT scanning, CT scanning was actually first invented in the late 60s and first finally used for medical reasons in the early 70s. And just 10 years later, it was applied to a fossil. So in like, I think 1984, and one of the Archaeopteryxes was CT scanned. So CT scanning has been around for a very long time, and it's great. It allows us to like get way more morphological information, like more information from a skeleton that we could previously. So, for example, if half of a fossil is embedded in rock, you CT scan it, you can see the other half, right? Or you can go inside the bones. So you can go inside the skull and you can see what the shape like of the brain cavity is like. And basically your brain can't like slosh around inside the skull. So your brain fits very tightly within the skull. So that allows us to see what the brain would have looked like. You can actually see different lobes of the brain, and it allows us to be like, this dinosaur could smell good, and this dinosaur could see well, and things like that, which is very cool for helping us to better understand these animals. Absolutely. But there are also other technologies that are more recently emerging that I think are very cool. And a lot of them aren't necessarily new technologies like in the world, but they are new technologies for paleontologists because paleontologists have traditionally just been like rolling up our sleeves and getting out in the dirt and digging around and then like finding a bone and drawing it and being like, that's what it looks like. And I'm going to name it. And like the end. But now we're taking other technologies from other fields of science, like chemistry, for example, and we're using it in paleontology. And the things that people are able to do with these technologies is absolutely fascinating. So there's actually so I think the coolest thing right now is the application of Raman spectroscopy to paleontology. And so this is basically getting chemical spectral data using a Raman spectrometer or a Raman, I think it's a microscope, a Raman microscope. But anyways, basically there's a scientist named Yasmina Veman who's at John Hopkins University. She used to be a postdoc here at the Field Museum. And she's, for example, she can use Raman spectroscopy to detect metabolic byproducts fossilized in bones that are hundreds of million years old. And she can actually tell you what the upper metabolic limits of that extinct animal were. So, and metabolism kind of is sort of like a proxy for body temperature. Like if you have a high metabolic rate, you're going to have a high body temperature as well. So it helps us to better understand the physiology of extinct animals. So, for example, in a paper that was published in Nature, which is like the best journal, just a few years ago, like maybe 2, 3 years ago, she was able to answer the question that and show definitively that dinosaurs were warm blooded. So birds are actually hot blooded, like mammals are warm blooded, birds are blooded because they have even higher metabolic rates and even higher body temperatures than mammals. But and it was actually in the 70s that during the so-called dinosaur renaissance, where a man named Bob Bacher first proposed that maybe dinosaurs were warm-blooded. And then some people kind of were like, well, the artists were already drawing dinosaurs as warm-blooded. So again, how artists kind of affect, and actually Bob Bacher used to be an artist. So like, oh, so many like, connections there. But anyways, but it was this big debate because it was like, okay, like some of them seem warm-blooded, but some of them, like Stegosaurus with its really tiny brain, seem like they're cold-blooded. Because if you have a large brain, you have to have a high metabolism in order to produce the energy to sustain that large brain. So there's lots of different proxies that we paleontologists have used to guess if an animal is warm-blooded or cold-blooded. And a large brain is like that probably means it's warm-blooded. But Yasmina was able to use these chemical signatures to say for sure that the earliest dinosaurs were warm blooded. But most groups of dinosaurs secondarily evolved to be cold blooded, which is why it was so confusing for us. So if you look at all dinosaurs, they weren't all warm blooded, but they all evolved from an animal that was warm blooded.
That was
So, like,
warm-blooded.
yeah.
Mm.
So like Triceratops, Stegosaurus, they were cold-blooded animals, but their ancestors were warm-blooded. And actually, one thing that's really and one of the reasons we were so confused by this is because when we try to understand the biology of extinct animals, we use what we call the extant, that means living, the extant phylogenetic bracket. So basically, you look at the animals that are alive that are on either side like of that kind of like bracket the extinct animals. So for example, with dinosaurs, extinct non-bird dinosaurs, non-avian dinosaurs, the bracket is crocodilians because crocodilians are the only other living archosaur reptiles and birds, right? And crocodiles are cold-blooded. The living crocodiles are cold-blooded and birds are warm-blooded. So we were like, when did warm-bloodedness evolve? But this is an example of how looking at a living organism and making assumptions about its ancestors can lead you astray. So actually, crocodiles are also secondarily cold-blooded. They also evolved from an ancestor that was warm-blooded. So archosaur reptiles are, when we think about reptiles, we think about them being cold-blooded, and snakes and lizards definitely are, but archosaur reptiles as a group were mostly warm-blooded, with only certain lineages evolving to be cold-blooded. So, anyways,
No,
there's so many cool things there. Yeah.
that is really cool. I mean, you can definitely like I feel your passion just exuding. And that's really important, when you think about how all of this information is communicated, as we talked about before, just making the public aware. And you even mentioned, communicating this to children. And I know that, wrote a children's book about, called When Dinosaurs Conquered the Skies. So can you just talk a little bit about, like how you engage the public and really try to inspire maybe their interest in paleontology, and it also, is related to just inspiring, other young women, girls and boys, if they're interested in entering into this scientific field.
Yeah. So most paleontologists that I've met, they seem to love the limelight. Like put the camera on me and let me tell you about dinosaurs. They love it, and I just really have to say that that's not me. I have like pretty bad social anxiety. I get like real nervous. I think it's important to be honest about these things and not be ashamed. Like just But yeah. So I working in China, there was never much of an outreach component. I would do it occasionally, I didn't do it a lot. And then I came to the Field Museum and they're like, they put in the media, like, meet our new dinosaur curator. And it was just so interesting to see the response where people were like, wow, if I had seen somebody like her when I was a kid, then maybe I would have pursued science. Or, oh, it just means so much for me to see a mixed race person, be a paleontologist. Yeah, and I never wanted to be that role model. Like I never like felt like I was good enough for that, but I seeing those comments, it really made me realize how important it was to like embrace that role. And yeah, so I wrote the children's books. The publisher actually reached out to me and was like, "Do you want to write a book?" And I was like, "Sure." And I actually really, really enjoyed writing it. I had a lot of fun. And I tell everybody, if you read my book, then you know everything that I know, like minus the couple things I've learned in the last like 2 years. But yeah, as a curator, we do a lot of events where we do meet a scientist events where we go out there and we go into our science hub and we're there for hours just talking to the visitors who come through, or we do we have museum members nights where people can come in and we talk to families. And I think I just want to say, for me, it's easy to get people excited. I mean, they come in already excited about dinosaurs, but with the Archaeopteryx, yeah, I mean, everyone loves dinosaurs, right? So for me, it's not hard to get people excited. But but for the Archaeopteryx, that was a bit more of a challenge because Archaeopteryx is a dinosaur, but people are like, "Oh, the name is hard to say. It's small. It's like it's a bird dinosaur." Like, so that this has been my challenge this year to get people really excited about just how important this fossil is, and also to really teach them this really cool, compelling story because they come in, they already know about T-Rex, they already know about Spinosaurus, but they don't know about Archaeopteryx. So then I can teach them about birds and why birds are so special. Because that's another thing that's cool about paleontology is that you can help people better appreciate the animals that are around them today. Because everything that's on our planet today has that evolutionary story, and that's what I'm studying. So like most people, like, I mean, sure, there are birders. People love birds, but your average person doesn't really care about birds. And when you're like, you teach them like birds are dinosaurs, they're like, yeah, I know. And I'm like, a pigeon's a dinosaur. And they're like, what? And I'm like, you've probably, unless you're a vegetarian, like if you've eaten dinosaur. And they're like, it's so funny. I told this to a class of Mongolian students, like, it was like late at night. I was like zooming in with them, like they were in Ulaanbaatar. And like when I told them that they've probably eaten dinosaur, they were like, they all got grossed out. They're like, ew, I've eaten a dinosaur. Like, I don't know. It was so funny. So I think like really, again, to like talk it, tie it into the sustainability thing. It's like people might love dinosaurs, but you got to use that love of something that's extinct to bring them to appreciate what we have now. To like, it's like like, okay, you love dinosaurs. Well, dinosaurs are still alive. Birds are dinosaurs. Like, and then to kind of appreciate the diversity that is alive on our planet now. And because we can only protect what we know and what we care about. So this is a big thing for people who study modern biology, where if a species hasn't been discovered yet, we can't preserve it, we can't protect it, we can't protect its habitat, that kind of thing. So it's really about helping people to know the world around them, know that this beautiful planet that we live on. And if I can get them excited about what our planet's history and use that to get people excited about what our planet today, then yeah, I think that's my main mission.
Yeah, and I think you're definitely doing that mission because again, I could definitely feel that passion. And it's really important. And I like that you also mentioned, just understanding why your representation, is so important within the space and to just be able to use that to bring other people in and to have people engage, from all different facets of life in the world. And I know that you've done a lot in this area, but maybe are there any like unanswered kind of questions maybe in your field that you hope, future research will address?
Oh my goodness, there are millions of questions. And like when you do research, like usually when you try to answer one question, all you do is, maybe you sort of answer that question, but like 10 new questions arise
I was
from it.
gonna
I mean,
say other questions pop
yeah,
up.
there's just so many crazy things. Like, for example, like this is not technically birds, but there's this pterosaur, this giant pterosaur called Quetzalcoatlus. It's like the largest animal to have ever flown, supposedly, right? But I was like, I really was like, I don't think that thing flew. It's way too big. Like it's, the size of like a Cessna plane. It's huge. And so I was, yeah, for the longest time, I was like, I don't think it could fly. Like the reason it still has long wings is because it's quadrupedal. So it's walking on its wings. So it can't reduce them, blah, blah, blah. And then I just recently saw some data come out where they showed the bone tissue, and the bones are so thin. Like you could punch your hand through the thing's bone. And if it's so thin, it's super lightweight. So it probably suggests that it was indeed flying. But if it was flying with these paper thin bones, like how did it not like crumple its skeleton every time it landed on the ground?
Right.
I mean, that's like, and that's just like one example. There's just so
Yeah.
many, and Archaeopteryx, we've been studying this thing since 1861. We still don't know what it ate. And if you think about it, like that might sound like something that's not that important, but what an organism eats is how it directly interacts with
Yes.
other organisms by consuming them. Like that's one of the most important interactions, like ecological interactions. So like there are a million questions. So this, and I think this is really important to let future paleontologists know, because I think a lot of times people think, you know, we've been doing science for over 100 years, 200 years, like we figured everything out. And I'm talking about like Western
Right.
science, right?
Yeah.
But I want people to know, like, we don't know anything. Like almost everything we do know is wrong, like at least partially wrong. We're just always ever moving closer to the truth, but never really quite getting there. And there are so many things to discover and so many things to learn and figure out that, yeah, I just want, future scientists, future paleontologists to know there's plenty of work for them.
Yeah, I mean, and it definitely sounds like a fascinating space that definitely connects all different areas. So not even just paleontology, but bringing in other kind of aspects of, the STEM and STEAM fields. Is there anything else that maybe like you're really curious about, something that you really think about often? And it doesn't have to necessarily be like tied to your particular field of study, but anything that, like you're curious about that, kind of, quote unquote, keeps you up at night thinking.
Well, oh goodness. What keeps me up at night is how Archaeopteryx could fly without an ossified sternum, breastbone. But in terms of like just bigger scientific questions, I think one thing that really fascinates me is to think about how the way our humanness affects our ability to do science, right? So let me give you an example of this. So a lot of early reptiles and some lizards today have this thing called like a parietal foramen, or like a third eye on top of their head. And so this is something that we see in fossils. We could see it in the skeleton. There's a big hole right on top of the head, right? And depending on the species, the hole moves. Sometimes it's more forward located, sometimes it's in the back, sometimes it's small, sometimes it's tiny, sometimes it's gone. It's also present in living animals, so you can dissect it. You can do a CT scan. You can see the huge bundle of nerves going down into the brain. Despite all this, we don't know what it does, right? And so, like, and the leading hypothesis is that it was for helping these animals to regulate their circadian rhythms, to like determine if it's light or dark outside. But I'm like, but it's got eyes, and like lots of other animals regulate their circadian rhythms. They don't have the pineal, they don't have this organ. So, like, it doesn't make sense to me. So, but I think it's like if you tell somebody to imagine a sense that they don't have, it's
Mm,
impossible to do.
it's really
Imagine a
difficult.
way, yeah, imagine a way of perceiving the world, like, different than the way we perceive the world. It's impossible. And I think it's really important for us to think about how the limitations of our biology will make it essentially impossible to learn certain things about our planet, about the universe, And I think that, yeah, and to think about like what would it be like if the thalamus wasn't throwing away 90% of the information that we're picking up in our brains. Like, think about all that information that's out there that, like, and just to think about the fact that when we're looking around us in the room, this is not actually what's really there. This is just how we're perceiving it. Like, I don't know, like those are the kind of things that I like to, you know, get like just lose myself over thinking about. I mean, the world is just such a fascinating place, and
Yeah.
I mean, I leave those questions to people smarter than myself. I don't think I'm a particularly like, I'm not very smart, to be honest. And I think, again, this is also something that I'm happy to on openly talk about, because I think a lot of times people are also intimidated to be a scientist. You have to be so smart. I say to people, actually being really, really smart sometimes is a detriment, because if you're super smart, then you don't second guess yourself. You don't think maybe I was wrong, maybe I
Mhm.
made a mistake. You often can be sloppy and arrogant if you're too smart. So, if you, as long as you're curious, passionate, and you're willing to work hard, anybody can be a scientist.
I mean, how could you end it any better than with that advice? I mean, I think that that's super cool. And for you to really be like a leading female paleontologist, to leave that advice, for, future women who are aspiring to go into these fields, or even for those who may not be aspiring to go into these fields, but just have some sense and understanding of like what it takes. And I think it's really important to understand, like, as long as you're curious curious. And, you mentioned like solving problems and putting together a puzzle, like using the pieces to put together a puzzle. I think is really impactful when you think about, the different, areas that you can go into with STEM and STEAM. And so I just want to thank you, Dr. Jingmai O'Connor, for being with us today, for, sharing your experiences, and also just for coming with so much passion and energy. I know many times, being in these spaces, the myth is that, these subjects can be dry and boring, but I mean, you just exuded so much passion that, I just really thank you for, being able to explain, what it is that you do, why you love to do it. And I know that our audience loves it too. So thank you so much for joining us. And it was a pleasure to have you.
Well, thank you so much, Aisha. And, with the paychecks that come with paleontology, all kids out there, don't do it unless you're passionate about it.
Take that advice. Thanks so
Yeah.
much.
All right. Have a wonderful day.
Ignition Sequence is produced by Accelerator Media, a nonprofit organization dedicated to inspiring a lifelong pursuit of knowledge. Join us every week as we dive into the science, the stories, and the extraordinary journeys that challenge our understanding of the world. Subscribe now and ignite your curiosity with us. Ignition Sequence. Listen, learn, repeat.